Is Jaylin Warren on track to be Austin Ekeler or Tony Pollard? We're going to talk about that and a couple of quick topics here tonight. What's up, guys? It's Matt Mormann here from the ADP Average Dudes podcast. And, I did one of these a couple weeks ago, just a quick little mailbag style episode here where I'm going to take some questions from Reddit. Last time I took them from the general fantasy football page. This time I'm going from the DynastyFF page on Reddit. So we're going to talk a little bit about Dynasty Fantasy Football here and just some questions, some things floating around in the community. I went to some of the top questions recently posted. And so we're just going to take a look at those and just give my little input on a few of them. So let's take a look here at our first one. This comes from Stankterdy, I think is how you would say that. And he asks, is Jaylin Warren an early Tony Pollard, Austin Ekeler situation? Given the history of Pollard and Ekeler, is there a similar trajectory for Jaylin Warren to follow a similar path to being a viable RB1? Feels easy to compare him to Pollard and Ekeler, who were forced to sit behind less efficient stars earlier in their careers, but show more with less given the opportunities. Their path to their respective fantasy positions makes me feel inclined to believe Warren will soon pass Najee in the pecking order, simply because I believe he is visually the more talented player. Are others feeling the same way? Does Arthur Smith help or hurt Warren? Is the greasy QB situation going to deter him? And yeah, the QB situation is definitely not great for him. And one thing with both Pollard and Ekeler that's really a thread there is the offenses, right? Think about what these Chargers offenses have been during Ekeler's time. Ekeler's time basically lining up with Justin Herbert's time. Ekeler had a year or two before Herbert, but even with Phillip Rivers, it was still a really good offense, far better than I would ever expect this current Steelers offense to be. I think the Arthur Smith of it all, it makes me a bit more interested in Najee, just because I think Arthur Smith prefers that bigger back. He doesn't want to overload a guy like a Jaylin Warren versus I think he'd be more willing to use Najee Harris more often still, despite maybe not necessarily should, right? Like the question mentioned here, Jaylin Warren's been the better player. And it was kind of one of my calls going into this season that we would see Jaylin Warren really eclipse Najee Harris and take over that job there in Pittsburgh. I don't know if I can quite go with a Austin Ekeler where it is super high-end production. Ekeler's been among the top backs in fantasy for the last couple of years now. I can't quite put that on Jaylin Warren. I think Tony Pollard's probably a pretty good place to start, right? When we finally did get to see Pollard have a bit more of a role, it wasn't nearly as good. And I do think maybe that would happen if we got too much out of Jaylin Warren touch-wise, right? The efficiency would maybe start to fall off then. But I do think that he definitely has a bit more Tony Pollard in him, though. My big concern is the offense. Look at what those Cowboys offenses were able to do the last couple of years, and then think about where you're expecting the Steelers offense to be for the next couple of years. I know there's a pretty big disconnect there. And so unless something changes there and a better quarterback situation arises in Pittsburgh, which I don't really see the path for at the moment, I'm going to say he's not going to be a Tony Pollard or a Austin Ekeler, but maybe he can be a bit more of a PPR reliable catching, airbag type who can make a couple of big plays. I'm currently kind of blanking on who that comp would be recently. But, a guy who can catch a lot of passes out of the backfield, give you a nice PPR floor potentially if he can carve out more of a workload. And then, he's going to need a good touchdown rate, though. And I just don't see that coming to be at that Ekeler or even that Pollard threshold. This one comes from Dynasty Day Traders. Hey, I like that name. This is Marvin Mims versus Josh Downs. Now, I'm not going to read quite this entire question because it is pretty long here. I'll leave it up on screen for a few seconds for you to take a look at it yourself. But it basically breaks down that, Downs is pretty universally favored over Marvin Mims at this point in the community, and their differences aren't that huge. Downs was a better player than Mims in the rookie year, I think pretty substantially better, but on a route run basis, they were actually pretty similar. I think part of that's because Downs played a lot and Mims played a little, and Mims did have a couple of very big plays. He also mentions that Mims was a better draft pick than Downs. And that's totally true. And I agree with that as well to an extent, right? I was very much in on Marvin Mims last summer, a little bit out on Josh Downs. I've definitely kind of flipped that script too. I think There's two things, though, that factor big into this for me. Number one, just being we saw Josh Downs playing more and being more effective, right? Like, yes, on a per route run basis, they're pretty darn close. And Mims, in a lot of ways, was even better with big plays and stuff. But when you have such few amount of plays, right? Playing time is earned to an extent. And yeah, there's some stuff in front of him in that roster on that depth chart that, he would need to get in front of. But I feel like we're at the point where Marvin Mims or anybody should not feel like Jerry Jeudy's a hurdle, to tackle. I feel like at this point, Jerry Jeudy's a player who, like, if you're good, you should be passing him on the depth chart and you should be running more routes and playing more often. And so the fact that Marvin Mims wasn't able to do that definitely just has me a bit concerned about Marvin Mims. I'm kind of at the point now where with Marvin Mims, I'm a little scared to put him in just into the Sky Moore bucket, but there's definitely some Sky Moore creeping up over here, my feelings in regard to Marvin Mims. And that's very concerning. I think at this point, I'm pretty well willing to take a third-round pick, right? Like, if I can just get the pick back that I took Marvin Mims with and get a reroll, I would be very happy to do that. As far as the two are concerned, head-to-head, I'm definitely taking Josh Downs at this point over Marvin Mims. I think better QB situation is also a bit of a thing. We definitely don't know what the quarterback situation is going to be in Denver at the moment. I think at this point, the absolute best case scenario is J.J. McCarthy out there in Denver. Feels like Jarrett Stidham might happen out there, right? And that would be terrifying for Mims. And look, if that depth chart does shake out pretty well in his favor, if one of those guys does get moved that's ahead of him, then I think there's definitely some hope to be had still with Mims, but I'm very hesitant with it. Last question here comes from Beanman95. Everyone is talking about the second-year QBs, but no one is mentioning Will Levis. Don't really get why no one is mentioning Levis with all the second-year QBs or QBs in general. Levis had the worst O-line, had basically no help outside of Hopkins, still looked good. Plus, he had to deal with an old-school run-first offense. Dude made plays constantly with players in his face. Titans have the third most cap and should bring in some offensive line help and wide receiver help, not to mention all-new offensively minded head coach. Plus, Levis never got to run, which he was good at in college. I see a Josh Allen second-year jump incoming. So let's just address that last part first here, right? The Josh Allen comparison. To me, that's a little bit strong. We got to remember, when Josh Allen really had that breakout, it involved Stephon Diggs. I don't see a Stephon Diggs coming onto this roster. If that happens, outstanding, right? Brandon Ayuk, right? If Ayuk lands in Tennessee, then maybe I can get on board with that. I think I'm just going to push back a hair bit on that, and I can't quite get that excited about Levis. I think it also depends how you felt with him as a prospect. A year ago this time of year, I was a little in, a little out on Levis. I think he belonged in round 1, but he ended up going in round 2, so the NFL kind of told you what they thought about that to an extent. I think that Hopkins is not a great player to have as your number 1, and I still kind of expect Hopkins to be off this roster at some point this offseason. Now, I think maybe they bring in like a Tyler Boyd. He's got connection with the new head coach for sure. And I think, having a new offensive coordinator in place there who can, play more pass-first offense, right? Derrick Henry's going to be off this roster, so that's going to open up, think about how many times Derrick Henry just runs the ball 20-plus times, right? That's just going to go away now. I think one of my things for Will Levis is that, outside of that very first game, he really didn't do a whole lot that really inspired me. First game was awesome. Lit the world on fire against Atlanta. Threw 4 touchdowns in that game. He only threw 4 more for the rest of the season from there on. And, he got banged up towards the end, right? Missed a couple games, sure. But really from that point on, and he had some matchups to really take advantage of, too, in that span, he just really didn't. And I think it's really hard to look at him and be excited for a potential breakout when comparing him to, of course, C.J. Stroud, right? And of course, Anthony Richardson, right? The other two big-time rookie quarterbacks from last year. Ironically enough, the number 1 overall pick, Bryce Young, kind of falls out of that category. And quite frankly, I think currently as we sit, I still prefer Bryce Young over Will Levis. But it's a lot closer than it really ever should have been. And part of that is the weapons, right? Levis has a Chigo Okonkwo and a Treylon Burks who, quite frankly, I like more than any weapon on Carolina, more than Adam Thielen, right? So there's other guys there to at least kind of help him make hay a little bit in this offense. But there's just not a whole lot going on there. I do like Bryce Callahan. I think Will Levis is a pretty nice little buy low candidate, though, right? If we can get through this draft and Tennessee kind of commits to Will Levis as their guy for sure, I don't mind the idea of in a Superflex league having Will Levis be my QB3. I'm okay with that going into this year. I think there is a bit of upside, a bit of hope that he is their guy going forward, at least for the next couple of years, to give him the chance to fail, right? And we'll see. Maybe he doesn't fail at all. Maybe he's really good with it or just good enough with it and it survives. But I think he deserves at least the opportunity to fail. Whether or not that happens or not, we will see. But I do think that there's definitely a lack of enthusiasm with Will Levis in comparison to those other rookie quarterbacks. But I think part of it's because it's deserved for both C.J. Stroud and Anthony Richardson. And unfortunately, Levis kind of is more that murky area where it just isn't quite deserved for him. But I think it's a fair find here to say that, yeah, he's definitely got some upside that most people are not talking about. All right, guys, so that's going to wrap it up for the questions from Reddit for today. Let me know if you got any other questions that you would like answered. Throw those down in the comments below here, and we will answer some of those moving forward. Hey, I'm going to be talking a little bit more here about some of the rookies coming forward. I just did a bit on talking about the rookies for this upcoming NFL Draft Combine. Take a look at that so you are all set for this weekend.